For the knights, Anek the clerk, live by him who does the work. Sound familiar? Of course! But this poem was written during the medieval period in Europe that lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. The exact date of the poem was not written down, so we don't even know the name of the poet. But being as bright a witch as I can simply use my power to assume it was written by one who does the work. That was the time of feudalism, and the poet must have been a serf or peasant who talked too much for his or her own good.
It is I, Lady Hexera, to give you the good news about witchcraft, and so much more. But first, we must start at the beginning. Today we'll explore the first chapter to the book Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, by the philosopher Sylvia Federici. This chapter is entitled, All the World Needs a Jolt! A Jolt! Quote, all the world must suffer a big jolt. There will be such a gain that the ungodly will be thrown off their seats, and the downtrodden will rise. Thomas Munster, in his work, Open Denial of the False Belief of the Godless World on the Testimony of the Gospel of Luke, presented to miserable and pitiful Christendom, in memory of its heir, 1524.
So what exactly was feudalism? How did it all begin? When and for what reason did it occur? What is what? Hang on! I'm going to explain.
As with most things in the West, we begin our story with the Roman Empire. It always goes back to the Roman Empire.
By the 5th century, the grand Roman Empire had fallen to the barbarians. Everywhere, Roman civilization was under attack. Constant wars disrupted trades. Merchants feared pirates on seas and outlaws on land. Without the empire, cities as centers of administration collapsed. With little trade, towns were no longer the center of business. The city dwellers left their decaying cities and settled in the countryside. They started growing their own food. The population of Europe became overwhelmingly rural. And that's when a new economic and social system developed in medieval Europe, in which nobility held lands from the crown in exchange for protection. At the heart of the feudal system was an agreement between a lord and a vassal. A vassal was a person who received land from a lord. The personal bond of loyalty that held a vassal to his lord was the key to the feudal system. The oath sworn between them was the equivalent of today's contract. But the feudal game was much more complicated than you might imagine. Much more! The piece of land that a vassal received from his lord would be then redivided. The piece of land was called a fief. The word feudalism is from the Latin word feudum, meaning a fief.
A fief was both property and a set of rights granted to a vassal, fealty, literally in fee, to a lord. These rights included the right to live on the land, the right to own your own family, which slaves had not previously had, the right to pass down land to one's descendants. The rights of a vassal were enshrined in the class relation of serfdom.
Quite complicated, isn't it? Let me solve it to you by showing you my cauldron. Here, look. You can see a pyramid in it. Yes! The feudal system was exactly like a pyramid. At the bottom were many serfs, each with a small fief. Above them were the lords, who held larger fiefs. All over all was the king. The great Roman Empire rested on the use of slave labor, whereas feudalism rested on the labor of serfs. Serfs were not the same as slaves. Serfs technically had rights, which slaves did not. The society had evolved into a new social system, and so had the social relations with it. Most of the fief that was used for farmland was divided into sections called manors. A manor was made up of several acres of arable land, upon which the serfs, which were the tenants of the lord, worked day and night. In return for a fief, serfs were bonded to their lord. Their persons, possessions, lives were controlled by the laws of the manor.
With the property given to them, it gave the serfs direct access to the means of their reproduction. They used the land to not only meet their lord's needs and desires, but also to meet their own needs. Even while struggling against their lords, they still had the means to survive, and kicking serfs off of their land was uncommon because feudalism was largely a closed economy. limited to individual localities, which means it was hard to find replacement labor.
Serfdom, too, was divided up into groups and communities. There were bonded serfs, free serfs, male peasants, women peasants. Unsurprisingly, women, like myself, were treated as second-class citizens when it came to owning property or holding political offices. But there was significantly less division of labor amongst the sexes. Unlike today, there was little separation between producing goods and reproducing the workforce. Because serfdom was largely subsistence-based living, all work contributed to the family's sustenance.
Today, housework is significantly devalued and not considered real work, even though it's the literal reproduction of the species. Most of what they produced, whether food, goods, or services, was owed to the lord. You might think they would have needed money every day to buy things, but you'd be wrong. In feudal times, almost nothing was bought. Feudal life went on with very little use of money. It was an economy of consumption in which each manorial village was practically self-sufficient. If someone asks you what you paid for a new coat, the chances are 100 to 1 that you'd give an answer in dollars or cents or however your currency self-identifies. But if that same question were posed to someone in the Middle Ages, the chances are equally as good they would have answered, I made it myself. The serfs grew their own foods and with their own hands made whatever furniture they needed. The lords of the manor attached to their households those serfs who were good craftsmen to make the things they needed and desired. The manorial village was a closed economic system where valuable goods like food, weapon, tools, furniture, etc. did not travel far in the period between their origin and their end. The manorial village made the things it required and immediately consumed them. Essential to feudal life for the peasants was their use of the commons. The commons were territories that belonged to no one. Open fields, wild pastures, deep forests, and more were common areas available to anyone. Peasants supplemented their subsistence living with berries, nuts, firewood, rocks from quarries, all available in the commons. They supplemented their diets by hunting and fishing from small ponds. Many peasants collectively agreed to an open field system of agriculture, or, quote, an arrangement by which villagers own non-contiguous strips of land in a non-hedged field. Peasants chose a strip of land in the commons to farm in addition to the farming they did on the land provided to them by the lord. Peasants also used the commons so their livestock could graze. The commons were also an important space for peasant social gatherings and celebrations. Quote, besides encouraging collective decision-making and work cooperation, the commons were the material foundation upon which peasant solidarity and sociality could thrive. All the festivals, games, and gatherings of the peasant community were held in the commons. They were essential to a harmonious peasant community, and for women, like myself, were the centers of social life. It was the place where us women, quote, convened, exchanged news, took advice, and where a woman's viewpoint on communal events, autonomous from that of men, could form. We had less access to land and other rights, so the commons gave us a little extra autonomy, not just from the lords, but also the patriarchy. In the next chapter, we'll learn how the enclosure of the commons destroyed much solidarity amongst the peasants, and particularly how it affected us women.
Class relations certainly weren't smooth throughout the feudal period. The era is marked with endless peasant revolts and uprisings, because of course serfdom was still a system of exploitation. All the peasants, whether free or not, were tenants of the lord's manor. They paid dearly for the right to live and grow their crops on the lord's land.
By the 14th century, peasant revolts against the aristocracy became endemic and frequently armed. According to Sister Federici, quote, the main objective of the serfs was to keep hold of their surplus value and products and broaden the sphere of their economic and juridical rights. Not only were there endless taxes on peasants, death taxes, inheritance taxes, marriage taxes, taxes because we fucking said so. Peasants were also expected to give a significant amount of their time to their own lord's needs and desires, working the lord's crops, fulfilling the lord's military ambitions and desires. and so on and so forth. Between the taxes and labor, Sister Federici says, quote, revealed all the arbitrariness of feudal power. Thus, they were strenuously resisted.
So you see, life on the manor was very harsh. There were times when peasants even starved. They worked their fingers to the bone, but could barely save any surplus for their own. Surplus was an extra amount of goods on top of the labor they owed their lord. The tensions started when peasants started getting enough tricks of the trade, and they became fast in production. They started producing more, which they wanted to keep for themselves. And that's what the lords didn't let them do. And that's when the whole world needed a jolt! And it started. Viva la Resistance! There were many tactics serfs used before taking up arms. They stopped showing up to work on time. They let the crops spoil, or worked sloppily, taking unnecessarily long breaks, and worst of all, insubordination. And worst of all, what the lords called foot-dragging, false compliance, desertion, pilfering, poaching, were the everyday forms of resistance against the feudal system.
And if that failed, there was always armed revolt and murder.
Thou canst possibly hurt mine poor son. Look at what feudalism hath done to him. He is but a lord, burdened with delicate hands. He hath no learning on how to labor. 'Twas not his fault, this damned, abhorred, and earthy system of feudalism hath made mine son a helpless wretch. 'Tis him that claims the title of victim.
Yeah, I think it's time that you died now.
These are just a small list of revolts throughout the High Middle Ages. There was the Peasant Revolt in maritime Flanders from 1323 to 1328, the Touchons, a movement of bandits in southern France made up of urban artisans and rural peasants that lasted from 1378 to 1384, the English Peasant Revolt of 1381. In 1335, in Ghent, which is here, weavers attempted a workers' democracy that suppressed all authorities except those who performed manual labor. They tried again in 1378, which lasted until 1382. The Ciompi Revolt occurred in Florence in 1382. Cloth workers there forced the bourgeoisie to give the workers shared control of the government. In Catalan, what is modern-day Spain, revolts by the Remenses, a particularly brutal form of serfdom in Catalan, lasted from 1472 to 1486, and ended with King Ferdinand II of Aragon outlawing the more severe abuses of the Remensa system. In Germany, peasant wars began in 1476. Sister Federici says, quote, this escalated into 4 bloody rebellions, led by the Boonshoek, in English the Peasant Union, between 1493 and 1517, and culminating in a full-fledged war that lasted from 1522 to 1525, spreading over 4 countries. Describing this time period, Sister Federici states, quote, now is the time, well illustrates the spirit of the European proletariat at the close of the 14th century. An important change occurred during the 12th century.
The towns had now started emerging again, and a new class called merchants had come into being that later evolved into the city class.
These towns were given certain privileges and charters that allowed them an element of autonomy from the manors and therefore the politics of the nobility.
When the towns emerged and trade began, money too started thriving. That was the reason why the surplus was now more important than ever to the peasants, because they wanted to sell it in the towns. These towns had new hopes for serfs and peasants. They dreamed of a flight to the town, where they too could taste the free air. And many did flee to the town. This, of course, created a new crisis in feudalism. Where's all the labor?
The time eventually came when the nobility had no choice but to resolve this conflict. Sister Federici gives a good account of how it happened.
Commutation.
It was when the lords started paying the peasants for their labor services in terms of money, and peasants started paying for their rent to their lords in the same way. According to Sister Federici, it, quote, placed the feudal system on a more contractual basis. That's how the peasants started turning into wage laborers.
A new economy was now emerging with its own ways of exploitation of the working class. It was a tricky and hidden business. It came under the guise of freedom, but But it was no blessing. Its effects were very destructive. The money economy started creating class differences way wider than history had ever seen. It snatched whatever land the peasants had and turned them into free workers. Many of the poorest peasants now had no land of their own, no home. Women, like myself, suffered more. It also started being marked by gender conflict. Everywhere there was nothing but division. Women lost whatever rights they had before, the right to property and inheritance. Their income was reduced.
By the 13th century, women were leading the migration from the countryside to the renewed urban centers, and by the 15th century, they made up a large percentage of the population. Most women still lived in poverty, working low-paying jobs such as maids, hucksters, a person who sells small items, spinsters, and prostitutes. The city did not free women from patriarchal exploitation, yet it offered them significantly more autonomy than the rural manors controlled by the lords. Women could live alone, with their children, and some even formed autonomous collectives with other women. The urban centers also provided more work opportunities for women. While most were relegated to the vocations mentioned earlier, many women also worked as smiths, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, milliners, ale brewers, wood carters, and retailers. By the 14th century, some women were becoming school teachers, doctors, and surgeons. Some cities had public health care, and female doctors, especially those that specialized in obstetrics, were paid directly by the city government for their services. Here we see women performing jobs that a century later, and still today, would be considered male labor, and which they would later be excluded from. Sister Federici says, as urban women, quote, gained more autonomy, their presence in social life began to be recorded more frequently, in the sermons of priests who scolded their indiscipline, in the records of the tribunals where they went to denounce those who abused them, in the city ordinances regulating prostitution, among the thousands of non-combatants who followed the armies, and above all, in the new popular movements, especially that of the Heretics.
Whenever there was too much suppression and exploitation of any gender and a class, what happens? Movements! And that's how it happened here too. Women's movement started, but many people called it witchcraft, heresy. "'Tis magic that hath ravished." You must know of Dr. Faustus of the medieval times, who sold his soul to the devil. Why do you think he did it? Being a scholar of divinity, he knew far too much about the clergy and their corruption. Faustus would rather sell his soul to the devil and later ask forgiveness personally from God, rather than buying pardons from clergymen. He was a man of religion, an insider, and he knew how religion was being used to make a fool out of people. If a scholar could do that, why not the poor peasants who suffered the most from a brand of religion that has been used as a tool to suppress and violate their basic rights? As the peasants breathed the town air, their minds expanded. They started seeing and thinking. The more they tried to free themselves, the more they suffered. But they discovered more also. In the early Middle Ages, peasants were illiterate, and only a portion of clergymen could read and understand the Bible. With the emergence of towns and trade in the Middle Ages, many started training themselves in reading, as their new jobs required writing stuff down. Later, an earth-shaking invention, the printing press, shook the whole world to the core. Common man discovered what true religion felt like, especially the New Testaments and the spiritual teachings of Jesus Christ. Jesus sounded more like a rebel than a clergyman when he said,
"The rich will be poor forever."
All these new landless peasants started running amok in the wake of Commutation.
Different peasants groups and cults were formed, Millenarianism and the heretical sects. The Millenarian movements were composed of landless peasants, prostitutes, defrocked priests, and day laborers, or as Sister Federici calls them, quote, the wretched of feudal society.
Lords were certainly armed in the ways that peasants were not, and their power was backed by the teachings of the church. The church was the biggest landlord itself. In many areas, bitterness flared up as never before. Peasants started challenging the old beliefs in more ways than one. First, they refused to pay taxes to the church. Peasant women started denouncing the churchmen who abused. The revolt by the wretched against the noble was a new type of struggle, reached far beyond the limits of the manor, and envisioned a total change in society. Millenarianism was often accompanied by profound prophecies and apocalyptic vision. They came in many forms of organized groups of rebels. In many places it was cults who might have made Faustian pacts with the devil. In other places it was people who believed in the second coming of Christ. These were mainly spontaneous movements with little organizational structure. They were usually based on specific events or led by charismatic leaders, and as such, as soon as force was applied to them, they typically collapsed. While these movements were short-lived, they spoke to the desire for something new.
Some of these movements include, in 1224, there appeared a man called Pseudo Baldwin who instigated a civil war in Flanders. Flanders is here in modern-day Belgium, by the way, with the promise of gold and silver and social reform to poor Flemish weavers, metal workers, also known as fullers, and textile workers. In 1251, the Crusades of the Pastoral swept through northern France, burning and pillaging both the nobility and the clergy. The movement began when a mysterious Hungarian monk known only as the Master claimed to have been visited by the Virgin Mary. The movement of nearly 60,000 was made of young peasants, and they expelled archbishops, threw priests into rivers, sacked monasteries, and harassed Jews. In the 1260s, the movement of flagellants spread from Italy through several European countries. Flagellants would march through the cities by the thousands, whipping themselves in penitence to God. They accused anyone who refused to join them of being in league with the devil, and killed Jews and priests. A later poem states, "The serfs and the peasants held several parliaments. They spread out this command, 'He who is higher, he is the enemy,' and several of them made an oath that they would never agree to have lord or master." It was not the Millenarian movement, however, but popular heresy that best expressed the search by the medieval proletariat for a concrete alternative to feudal relations and its resistance to the growing money economy.
By denying the higher authority and making an oath to themselves and not the church, they were declared heretics by the church. There were, after all, many of them who, in their bitterness for the lords and church, turned their backs on their old belief. Heretical sects were a search for an alternative to feudalism, a conscious attempt at a new society. These were where us witches gathered. We reinterpreted religious traditions away from the church's hegemony, guided people's need for both spirituality and social justice, castigated social hierarchies, private property, and the hoarding of wealth by the nobility and the clergy. As my dear sister Federici says,
quote, "At the root of popular heresy was the belief that God no longer spoke through the clergy, because of its greed, corruption, and scandalous behavior. The heretics' challenge was primarily a political one, since to challenge the church was to confront at once the ideological pillar of feudal power, the biggest landowner in Europe, and one of the institutions most responsible for the daily exploitation of the peasantry." One of the most rebellious groups were the Cathars. They rejected marriage and procreation and redefined the sexual morals, while the church saw women as Eve, the great temptress. The Cathars held a great importance to women, and they rejected the church's attitude towards women. They also scorned the church's attitude towards chastity. Some of the groups, as Sister Federici says, attributed the mystical value to the sexual act, even treating it like a sacrament. Sister Federici says, the Cathars also stand out as unique in the history of European social movements because of their abhorrence for war, including the Crusades, their condemnation of capital punishment, which provoked the Church's first explicit pronouncement in support of the death penalty, and their tolerance of other religions. Beyond the Cathars, there were the Waldensians of Lyon in the late 12th century, the Brethren of the Free Spirit in the late 13th century throughout Germany, France, Bohemia, and northern Italy, the Taborites of Bohemia in the 1420s, and the English Lollards in the late 14th century. In many cases, whenever peasants began to revolt against their living conditions, they were labeled heretics, despite having no specific religious demands. Once labeled heretics, a crusade could be created against them by the combined power of the nobility and the church.
the most effective way to monitor and monopolize on sexual behavior leads to women. The church was well aware of, or rather afraid of, the power that women, like myself, had over men when it came to sexual desire. What was the cause of the fall of Adam? Eve. Making sexuality an object of shame was one of the church's ways to avoid women and strip them of their power. Women to them were nothing but a symbol of evil, even when they appeared in their most holy forms. Evil, according to the medieval church, resided naturally within them.
Quote, sexuality was not a private, but a state matter. If they could keep the power of one segment of the society at check by using religion as a tool, they did. Where there was no shame in sexuality, there was no shame in women. Here women could enjoy equal power and status. Female priests were worshipped as the ladies of thought. Women could preach and baptize. In these groups, men and women lived free together. Women had their own communities as well, outside male control. It was, in fact, women who gave life to the Heretics movement. Most of them came from the most suffering sections of serfdom and peasantry. The movement even bordered on a sexual revolution when women tried to control their own reproductive systems.
And that set the last alarm bell ringing. The sexual doctrine of some heretical groups posed a great threat to the church that monitored sexuality. When women took charge of their own bodies and reproductive symbols, they symbolically shook the feudal crown to its core. So the persecution of the worst kind, as lethal and cruel as history had hardly witnessed before, started. Women were tortured, abused, burnt alive at the stake in front of people's eyes. There were many women who were not even part of the groups, got killed brutally. The Inquisition is one of the darkest chapters in all of world history, especially for us witches, who were the harbinger of change. And the revolts were suppressed, but only for the time being.
In the midst of this turmoil between the 12th and 14th centuries came the Black Death. Much like current times, the pandemic shifted the entire power structure. Its devastation to society cannot be understated. Gaze upon this picture by 14th century Dutch painter Peter Bruegels. The triumph of death depicts hell on earth. It washed off more than half of the peasant population.
But those who were left were now confronted with the uncertainty of death and didn't give a fig of the rules of the lords. In this crisis of labor, they were now quite aware of their own labor power. The counter-movements and rebellions started again. The entire villages organized themselves to stop paying taxes and fines. The counter-revolution began, and this counter-revolution was targeted at women's sexuality, like my own sexuality. Throughout the medieval period, and still often today, having too many children is undesirable. That's why I only use homosexuality as my birth control. Therefore, various forms of birth control were used by women to attempt to limit the children they had. Sterility potions or maleficia were commonly used, along with the practice of sodomy, abortion, and infanticide. After the population and labor crisis caused by the Black Death of the 14th century, the church added reproductive crimes to the list of heretical activities. Sister Federici says, quote,
After the spread of the plague, the sexual aspects of heresy became more prominent in its persecution. Heretics were accused of animal worship, including the infamous Bacchium sub cauda,
the kiss under the tail,
and indulging in orgiastic rituals, night flights, and child sacrifices.
Or to divert the young male peasants from revolution, the sex card was used. They were granted open sexual relations even by the church now. This was not a real sexual freedom. Many criminals who were penniless sons of lords ended up raping working class and peasant women, and easily got away with it. The decriminalization of rape created havoc in the world of working class women, who after being raped had no place in society and ended up becoming prostitutes and later witches. The politicization of sexuality, especially related to heretical movements, quote,
marked the transition from persecution of heresy to witch hunting, and the figure of the heretic became that of a woman, so that by the beginning of the 15th century, the main target of the persecution against heretics became the witch.
In this video, we covered what feudalism was and how social relationships of the feudal society were formed and how many layers of exploitation it was based. How religion was used as one of the strongest weapons against the people. Eventually, people rose up against it. How women suffered and how that turning point was when they took charge of their own body. how independence was seen as equivalent to black magic, and how the people went through the cruelest torture ever in history, and what price they paid. No ideology has been spared in being used as a tool at the hands of the powerful classes, be it religion or even the concept of sexual freedom. In the next chapter, we will discover how a new emerging power, capitalism, used every ideology it could to exploit the working class. In its transition to capitalism, European society witnessed an earth-shattering bloodshed and violence against the working class. Women suffered double degradation, first because of their class, second because of their gender.
The peasant revolt ultimately suffered a blow when the new powerful class, the town bourgeoisie, shook hands with another powerful class, the nobility, and helped it to suppress the revolution.
Movements are contagious, and that's what the powerful classes have always been scared of. The early capitalist bourgeoisie started getting afraid that the revolutionary wave might reach the town workers as well, before the peasants and the workers could join hands. The nobility and capitalists did.
Quote, "It was the urban bourgeoisie, after 2 centuries of struggles, waged in order to gain full sovereignty within the walls of its communes, who reinstated the power of the nobility by voluntarily submitting to the rule of the prince, the first step on the road to the absolute state." Like and subscribe for more witchcraft, for more knowledge.
Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon!